plunge into the deep. Thanks for inviting me to talk today. It's a real pleasure to be here again. And of course, I have fond memories of the physical Sea and Society talks, which I've attended some of. But let's hope that this Zoom talk will do some good at least. So my talk is Unraveling Ocean's Past. And basically, I will try and convince you of a basic statement, namely that ocean policy is increasingly informed by insights into the past. And this is happening, not least thanks to some methodological breakthroughs. Transdisciplinary collaboration is now really underpinning large-scale research projects that promise to change how we understand the ocean's past and by implication ocean's futures. And I believe this comes with some implications for the decade of ocean science. We are using historical evidence to challenge ecological understanding, challenge historical understanding, and informing policy. So those are the three main points from this talk. And of course, this is not a new thing. It's really been developing in at least the last 20 years. One of the pioneers, of course, was Jeremy Jackson, who back in 2004 had this wonderful infographic made for a large-scale conference on marine science, where he made the basic point that we need to look to the past to understand the potential of the future. That by understanding how we have what we have lost, we may also know what we may be able to gain. And the key concept, of course, has been the shifting baseline syndrome, introduced by Daniel Pauly, but really been picked up by numerous scholars who have latched on to the basic idea that we as humans tend to believe that the world as we saw it in our childhood is the best of all worlds, and that we may believe our parents when they tell us that there were even more fish in the ocean back in their day. But when our grandparents tell us that there were even more fish, we start to think, oh, these old buggers can't really be trusted. And of course, if they tell us that way back there was plenty of fish, we start to think that these are just tales of that cannot be trusted. So the shifting baseline symptom is simply the idea that we need history and historical documentation to overcome our sort of inherent distrust of evidence that things were different in the past. And by introducing historical data, we may get a sense of how much has changed. And very often what we find is that by going back 100 years, we see an order of magnitude change in the ocean. This has already been picked up by not just the policy arena, but also really been picked up in management. State of the environment reporting now increasingly implies a knowledge of prior states to assess the trajectories of change. We need precise, calibrated, quantitative environmental time series for change in the seas and the oceans. And of course, such evidence is rare. Most of our observations only go back a few decades if we're talking about scientific data, at most 50 to 100 years. If we want to go back beyond that, certainly we need to look to other types of information. And we may need to do that because we are facing a real challenge of putting up better informed management proposals for the future. And this is clearly being evidenced in the Swedish Hav och Vatten interest. The new Symphony GIS tool is a wonderful tool which informs us of many things happening in the sea, but one of the things that have been recognized by the authorities is that historical data is clearly lacking. So I'm really pleased that Sarah Hornborg published only, I think, 1 or 2 days ago, this seminal report on the potential use of historical perspectives in Swedish marine management. I think this is a report that ought to be widely read, and I'm not going to steal her thunder, so I'm not going to talk about it, but I do want to alert you to this publication. Across the globe, there has actually been quite a wide take-up of historical data to inform ocean management. This has happened in a number of cases. I refer you to Engelhardt et al., who reviewed some 15 case studies, and I just selected a few here to identify the actual uses of historical data. So this is happening. And what does historical research provide? Well, data and narratives. In terms of data, you may look to historical information for information about baselines, such as species distribution, abundance, and habitat. Also for the effects of disturbance, for example, the introduction of noise pollution, response to climate change, and better algorithms and models. Obviously, if you have data series that go back several decades, maybe even a couple of centuries, your models will be much more able to capture change through time. History also provides strong narratives that may inform what is now increasingly called ocean literacy. This is the soft evidence for what you might say is informing our human imagination. Imagination about what is sustainable or not in the past and informing the present. It may help raise public awareness of what we are doing to an alien and unknown world, the sea, which we don't observe, but which is suffering the consequences of our impact. And these narratives may empower people in their choices as consumers and citizens. So the bottom line is that historical information is powerful. Humans are motivated very often not by data, but by strong narratives. And we can look to the historical information to both provide strong narratives and corrective data. Nevertheless, there are people who will say, well, can we really trust past evidence? When climate changes everything, the impact of future climate change may render all of the historical information irrelevant. If things are happening so fast, well, maybe we should be looking not at understanding the past, but really trying to get ourselves organized now. To that, I would say that, well, this presupposes sort of a perfect storm of climate change. If everything changes in the next 10 years, obviously, historical information will be of less relevance. But a lot of stuff don't change in this perfect storm scenario. Things play out at the decadal to centennial scale. And of course, a lot depends on how we respond to the challenges of the future. So a lot of the information about future climate scenarios is depending directly on our understanding of the past. And of course, it also depends on what will climate change mean to different parties. How have we depended on marine resources in the past, and how resilient are we in the face of future climate change? So a lot of information is absolutely relevant, even if climate will change. So far, so good. I would sum up that the recognition of the shifting baseline syndrome has caused ecologists to shift their focus from experimentation to historical observation. There is still some skepticism, but overall the demand is send more historical data. There aren't that many people in this marine historical community. It's a small community, but it is growing. Not least through the Oceans Past initiative, which gathers some 200 people worldwide who are sharing a newsletter and also attending annual conferences. Most importantly, the questions are getting ever more interesting. And I will try and give you some examples. But first, let me just talk briefly to what is in marine environmental history. Now, obviously, we're dealing with nature, but we're also dealing with humans, and humans use nature resources for production, and we turn natural resources into goods by our perception, by our intellectual capacity and our tools. So this is the environing triangle, you might say, where humans and nature are constantly interacting. In the ocean, of course, we're dealing with a multi-dimensional environment. We're not just looking at what's going on the surface, but also under the sea, above the sea, seabirds, around the sea, around our coasts, in the sea, of course, marine life. And we want to understand how all of this changes through time. So the challenges are big to any kind of understanding of marine environmental history. It needs to combine abiotic, biotic, and human information, bring all of this together in order to understand what is going on. So this poses tremendous multidisciplinary challenges to us. And of course, coming from different disciplines, we may actually be positive to collaboration, but we are also trained in specific ways, and we need to face those biases head on when we talk about collaboration. We need to recognize that we come with our specific biases. And just talking from my own experience, I would say that the biases I have experienced when working with ecologists is very often that ecologists tend to have a focus on generating general predictions, establishing the laws of nature. Ecology is a nomothetic endeavor, whereas history is really at heart an ideographic exercise. We are interested in establishing the unique fact, which means that we often have a resistance to modeling. We very often say that history never repeats itself, whereas ecologists will favor a clearly controlled experiment that can be modeled in a way so that we can predict future impacts. Ecologists, I would put it, often have a training which sort of forgets the discipline's origin as natural history with the fetish of the experiment. And this also means that the ecologists very often, when they talk about working across disciplinary divides, will prefer the economists, because economists, similar to natural scientists, have a very, I would say, mechanistic view of human society. Often when I have worked with ecologists, they would say, well, we really need the social sciences to put a price tag on the value of nature. And of course, the whole concept of natural capital has been enormously influential. Historians, on the other hand, tend to resist collaboration with natural scientists because it's claimed by many historians that we don't do nature. We are really just interested in the human motivation. So these biases are very real. We need to overcome them. And I believe that marine environmental history is doing that, but we live with those challenges. So how is this actually being overcome? Well, a lot of new exciting projects are really coming to the fore now. In the last 2 years, the European Union or the European Research Council has invested more than 30 million euro in what I would call marine environmental history. And those are only some of the projects that I identified, but it's quite clear that what is happening here is a focus on training a new generation of marine environmental historians, ecological historians, who will use a multiplicity of methods to understand how oceans have changed. And the chronological scope of the projects are from decades to millennial scale. I myself am involved as the coordinating PI of a synergy project called 4 Oceans. We have identified a goal, which is to establish a world atlas of marine historical exploitation, asking basically when and where was marine exploitation of major significance to human society. We are a bunch of historians, archaeologists, and geographers. I'll just give you one example of how this may really impact our understanding. These are early days, of course, but this is work which we have just completed, looking at the Newfoundland and Grand Banks fisheries. So the established or shared understanding of the collapse of the Grand Banks is that this happened as a result of overfishing in the 1980s and led to a dramatic collapse. Looking at the human impact on the Grand Banks, the publication by George Rose established that for centuries there was a sustainable fishery in the Grand Banks, which was clearly not overstretching the ecological productivity of the ocean. So this is sort of the established narrative, and this is the overall quantitative representation of human extractions from the Grand Banks. What we have done is we have reviewed this information by using a number of hitherto unexplored archival information, especially French notarial records, English Admiralty records. We have put all of this together in a very ambitious data set, which we have now published. And what we have done is really try to make sure that we have a full understanding of this very diverse information, try to calibrate the information so that we have a common measurability. And what we have found is that looking at the 300 years prior to 1800, the actual record of extractions is this one. We published it in a paper which has just come out in Historical Methods. And of course, this is just taking up the story to 1790, which begs the question, what happens in the 19th century? What we are finding, and we're working on this now, is that the 19th century records as well are deeply problematic and need a complete revision. So the take-home message from this is that already just before 1790, extractions were in the region of 600,000 tons from the Grand Banks. This means that a pre-industrial fishery was exerting a fishing pressure which is similar to levels that were only reached by the mid 20th century. So clearly there was a huge ecological pressure. Even in pre-industrial times, we need to at least take this on board when we make facile assumptions about the pristine nature of oceans in the past. Clearly, there's good evidence now that the human footprint in the ocean is of a much more ancient origin. And of course, if this is true, maybe our whole modeling of the ocean is in need of some revision. We also challenge historians for how we interpret the meaning of the fisheries. This complicated figure is simply trying to convey the assumption that historians most often make, namely that this period of the 16th, 17th, 18th century is very much driven by the discovery of the silver and gold mines of Latin America. Those mines, mineral mines, introduced a new wealth into European societies. What we did was simply to calculate what was the economic value of the North Atlantic fisheries. And we found that just the Grand Banks cod fishery represented 70% of the value of the gold and silver from America. And on top of that, of course, we have not even calculated, for example, the big herring fishery. So what we are finding in terms of our challenge to historians is that we perhaps need to think again about European pathways across the Atlantic. We are used to thinking in terms of the slave plantations. We're used to thinking in terms of the gold mines of South America. But we need also to include the marine resources of the North Atlantic as a second pathway that drove humans across the Atlantic. And a third challenge to our preconceived notions is actually coming out of a further understanding of the total extractions. This is based on quite new research, where we have actually brought together the cod and herring extractions from the North Atlantic. And what we are finding is that when we calculate the per capita consumption, how much fish was available per person in Europe through time, we see that by 1500, people were getting about 2 kilograms per person. By 1600, almost 5 kilograms of cod and herring was available per person. What's the implication of this? Well, it means that at times of scarcity, during periods of harvest failure, there is an additional food security, access to fish protein, especially in the lean spring months when your grain may be running out. When meat is extremely expensive, there is still a possibility for your survival because of marine protein. So we see an increase in human demographic growth through this period of the 16th century, whereas in the 17th century, we know that European demographic growth stagnated and even declined as a result of, in part at least, a lack of access to marine protein. Then we have an 18th century increase in per capita consumption, which aligns well with a human increase. So this is a neglected story, you might say. We are finding that marine resources in the past have been hugely important for human societies. They have created demographic growth. They have created fantastic economic wealth, and the ecological footprint goes back much further in time. So we are looking at lots of new questions that are coming as a result of bringing together people of many different disciplines. They are asking, of course, all sorts of questions, which is the attraction of multidisciplinary collaboration, that all of these single disciplines ask different questions, and we all need to sit together around tables and think through the data. Not so fast is my sort of response to all these questions. We need to think carefully. What's the longer term implication of all of this? I think it means that we can increase ocean literacy, which is enormously important to the present day. We need to understand what's put on our tables when we make choices as consumers of food, and we may learn from how we have interacted with the oceans in the past and the choices we have made. We can take this information to inform also better consumption strategies for the future. We clearly are in a position where it is no longer sustainable to take most of our food from the ocean at very high trophic levels. We need to shift our consumption to the bottom trophic level. In order to do that, we need to introduce smart eating and smart cities. And we need narratives to support this. And I believe the history interest will drive a lot of at least public uptake of these kind of recommendation. So I think historical research is increasingly informing the SDG 14 targets, life below water, as well as raising all sorts of questions about food sustainability and equality. So it's not just a question of what goes on below water. It raises immediately questions of what goes on above water. So this is a challenge. It is a challenge also to the marine science community. I think marine scientists need to embrace the fact that history is gaining importance and is a powerful tool. It is striking that at the launch of the Decade of Ocean Science in 2020, out of all this gathering of people, there was just one historian, João Paulo Oliveira e Costa, who gave a talk, a 5-minute talk on the ocean's cultural heritage. The rest was devoted to natural experiments and predictions devoid of insight into the past. I think also history will have a powerful role in informing future curricula for the schools. We need to make sure that this story of the human interaction is part of what may drive pupils' interest. So the challenge is really, what kind of science do we need for the ocean we want? I put it to you that we also need some history. Thank you.